Good morning. My name is Mark Baldassare, and I am the President and CEO of the Public Policy Institute of California and Director of the PPIC Statewide Survey. Welcome to our virtual program today featuring our latest PPIC Statewide Survey on Californians and their economic well-being. The survey and this event are supported with funding from the James Irvine Foundation. We thank them for their support. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any parties or candidates for public office. For today's program, my colleague, Dr. Dean Bonner, will walk you through some of the key findings from the survey. After the presentation, we'll discuss some of the key takeaways, and we'll answer any of your questions. If you have a question about the survey, send us an email and include your name and organization to the address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. We look forward to hearing your questions, and we have time later on to answer those questions. I would now like to welcome Associate Survey Director and Research Fellow, Dr. Dean Bonner. Thank you, Dean.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Mark. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. All right, so as Mark said, today we'll be talking about the Californians and their economic well-being survey. But more broadly, the PPIC statewide survey began back in 1998 and has interviewed over 400,000 Californians in over 200 surveys. This particular survey is the second annual survey on economic well-being of Californians. And what makes this survey especially special is the fact that it includes an oversample of Californians with incomes less than $40,000 per year. The survey was conducted online from October 12th to the 31st using the Ipsos Knowledge Panel. We interviewed just shy of 2,300 adults, and the margin of error for that group is 3.2%. Our interviews included about 1,500 folks that we consider likely voters, and the margin of error for that group is 3.9%. And as I mentioned, we have an oversample of lower income Californians, and we have just over 1,000, and the margin of error for that group is plus or minus 5%. So now to dive into the report. I want to begin with some general findings that capture how Californians are feeling about income inequality. And we find in this survey that a record high share of 69% of adults actually say that the gap between the rich and poor in their part of California is getting larger. It's noteworthy that this finding is unchanged from last year's survey, and majorities have felt this for quite some time. This belief is also widely held, with more than 2 in 3 across parties, 6 in 10 across regions, as well as majorities across demographic groups. But it's notable that Latinos, as well as the less educated and less affluent Californians, are more likely than others to say that the gap is getting wider. In looking to the future, in one of our more noteworthy findings, we find that more than 6 in 10 Californians think that when children today grow up, they will be worse off financially than their parents. It's notable that the findings are identical to last year, with 6 in 10 also said that, that children in the future will be worse off. And we also find that majorities across regions hold this view, but it's higher among residents in Orange, San Diego, as well as the San Francisco Bay Area. Across racial ethnic groups, 3 in 4 white Californians, along with majorities of Asian Americans and African Americans, say that today's children will be worse off in the future. But it is notable that Latinos are almost evenly divided on the question of whether these kids will be better off or worse off than their parents in the future. The share saying that kids will be worse off financially than their parents in the future increases with rising education and is much lower among parents of children 18 or under than non-parents. And turning to the economy more broadly, we find that Californians today are more optimistic about the prospects of good economic times than earlier in the pandemic. However, fewer than half today expect good economic times in the next year. But it is important to note that optimism today is actually nearly identical to what it was in January 2020 prior to the pandemic. Expectations of good times vary by region, with about half in Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area saying they expect good times, while majorities in the other regions actually expect bad times. We also find that majorities of African Americans and Latinos are optimistic about the future state economy, while majorities of Asian Americans and whites expect bad times. And there's actually a pretty wide political divide on this, with 6 in 10 Democrats expecting good times in the next 12 months, while more than 8 in 10 Republicans and 6 in 10 independents expecting bad times. So that's a partisan divide that's really notable. And when asked about the availability of well-paying jobs in their part of the state, most Californians are calling this a problem today. However, just 1 in 5 say that it is a big problem. It is notable that the share saying that the availability of jobs in their area is a problem has declined 9 points since last December. So that's a glimmer of hope in these findings. And the belief that the availability of well-paying jobs is a problem is widely held with most Californians across parties, regions, and demographic groups calling this a problem. And when we look at just those who call this a big problem, we find that this sentiment is most common among Californians with incomes of less than 20,000, as well as Republicans, Asian Americans, younger Californians, and those in Orange, San Diego. So turning to the personal finances of Californians, most people in the state today are saying that their finances are about the same as they were a year ago. However, important differences emerge across subgroups. While majorities across racial ethnic groups say that their finances are about the same as a year ago, African Americans are more likely than others to say that their finances are better off than a year ago. We also find that those with a college degree are twice as likely as those who never attended college to say that they are better off. And across income groups, those with incomes of under 20,000 are about 3 times more likely than those with incomes over 80,000 to say that they're worse off. So this group is definitely experiencing a financial reality different than more wealthy Californians. And notably, a similar 6 in 10 last year said that their finances were about the same as a year ago. And when we turn to a question that really gauges the financial stability of Californians, we find that while 6 in 10 Californians say that they could handle an emergency expense of $1,000 with little difficulty, there are notable differences once again across subgroups. While 8 in 10 higher income Californians say that this expense would be not too difficult, fewer than 1 in 5 with incomes less than 20,000 per year say this. In fact, 6 in 10 Californians with lower incomes say this would be very difficult or nearly impossible to handle this expense. Similar differences emerge across education groups, with fewer than half of Californians with no college education saying this expense would be not too difficult, compared to 8 in 10 among college graduates who hold this view. And across racial ethnic groups, Latinos are the least likely across racial ethnic groups to say this expense would be not too difficult. And an important aspect of this particular survey is our examination of the personal finances of Californians and delving into what financial hardships or difficulties their household may have experienced in the past year. And we asked about 10 areas of life where Californians may have experienced difficulty, and I'll highlight a few of those here. But it is worth noting that the crosstabs among all Californians, likely voters, and our oversample of lower income Californians are all available online, so you can take a deeper dive into these questions and others. And we find that about 1 in 5 Californians report that they or someone in their household reported being unable to pay a monthly bill, had difficulty paying their rent or mortgage, put off a doctor's visit, or cut back on food. We see these sharp differences once again when it comes to which groups experienced financial hardship and which did not. On all of these difficulties, African Americans, Latinos, and those making less than $20,000 per year are more likely to report experiencing these. It's also noteworthy that renters are more than twice as likely as homeowners to report difficulty in paying for their housing. And when we look at different types of economic aid that Californians have received in the last year, we find that about 1 in 6 Californians report receiving food from a food bank in their area, while 1 in 4 report receiving unemployment over the last year. Across subgroups, Latinos are the most likely across racial ethnic groups to report receiving aid, and lower income Californians are more likely than wealthier to report this. Reports of receiving food from a food bank or unemployment benefits is more common among those Californians without a college education, and is more prevalent among renters than homeowners, as well as among parents than non-parents. And we also find that these lived experiences translate into enhanced stress among those who have had these financial difficulties. Specifically, while about 1 in 5 Californians say they worry about healthcare costs, and 1 in 4 worry about housing costs either every day or almost every day, lower income Californians are much more likely than all Californians to worry about these finances. Notably, Californians with incomes under 20,000 are about twice as likely as those earning over 80,000 to report worrying about these two expenses. We also find that those with children under 18 in the household are much more likely than others to worry about healthcare costs, and renters are much more likely than homeowners to worry about the cost of housing. It's important to note that these kind of elevated worry among specific subgroups were very similar last year. So you're looking at over a year of this heightened amount of financial stress, which is causing Californians to have these elevated levels of worry. And in this survey, we also asked some of our questions of only the employed adults in order to understand more about their work experiences. And in doing so, we were able to find that most Californians are satisfied with their job, though fewer than 4 in 10 are very satisfied. But we also examined perceptions of upward mobility. And in doing so, found that 6 in 10 employed Californians say that their job offers opportunity for advancement, and half say that they have access to educational or training assistance. We find that African Americans, those with college education, and those with higher income are more likely than others to report having these prospects. And given we're a policy-oriented organization, we thought it was very important to gauge support for policies that could improve the economic well-being of Californians. With similar support compared to a year ago, Californians are generally supportive of these types of policies. Looking specifically at questions about offering a government-funded healthcare option and the expansion of the earned income tax credit for lower income Californians, we find broad-based support. In fact, more than 6 in 10 across regions and demographic groups report supporting these proposals. However, there are wide differences across parties, with overwhelming majorities of Democrats and independents in favor, compared to just 4 in 10 Republicans. And similarly, We also find overwhelming majority support for increased funding for more job training programs and increased funding for more childcare programs for lower income working parents. And in this case, about 7 in 10 or more Californians across regions and demographic groups support these policies. And it's notable that while childcare programs increased funding for childcare programs so that more lower income working parents fails to garner bipartisan support, more than 6 in 10 Californians across parties actually support more job training programs. It's notable that this was the only one of the 7 policies we asked about that garnered this bipartisan support. Now, our survey covered many other topics, and I would encourage you to go online and look for the crosstabs and the survey report that we have online, as well as some of the blogs that we have been and will be publishing on these very important topics. And last but not least, I want to encourage you all to submit questions, and you can do that by sending an email to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. At this point, I would like to stop sharing my screen and invite Mark back in to have a discussion about some of these findings.
Thanks a lot, Dean. That was a great summary of a very detailed and lengthy report. It's very different from every other survey that we've done during the course of this year, because of the fact that we have this oversample of 1,000 lower income residents in California, voters and non-voters alike in that sample. And it's a very unique survey, and we're very grateful that our partners, the Irvine Foundation, who has a strong interest in low-wage workers in California and improving the circumstances and conditions of low-wage Californians, shares that interest with us in the economic conditions and places where we might see that there are possibilities for improving conditions in particular. So very unique survey. I'd like to get to the questions as soon as we could from the audience, but a couple of things that I just wanted to mention. First of all, on the theme or the issue of this focus on on lower income residents, this survey really gives you an important window into the life of lower income residents in this expensive state that we live in. Because for many Californians, as this survey indicates, this is an expensive state where people, particularly lower income people, note that the difficulties that they face on a daily basis, reporting that they're financially worse off than they were last year, that they're not satisfied with their finances, that they would have difficulties paying for an emergency and expense of $1,000. And those are circumstances that higher income Californians don't have. So it's, I think, for this survey, really important. And also, as we recover from the economic circumstances brought about by the pandemic, this survey gives us a window into the fact that while some people's fortunes may have rose in the last year, other people are struggling. And lower income residents, more laid off, more experienced pay cuts, fewer were able to work at home than middle and especially upper income residents in California. Many lower income residents on a daily and weekly basis are worried about the cost of housing or how they're going to pay their bills. The amount that their debts are increasing, their inability to save for retirement, all of those things are noteworthy in this survey. And as Dean mentioned, we encourage you to go to the full survey, look at the results, compare and contrast the results, and you can also see the results for the 1,000 randomly selected lower income residents in the survey. Some general comments I wanted to make in terms of some things that are noteworthy about this survey. I found it very telling that because last year we just asked people whether they satisfied or not satisfied with their job. This year we asked how many people were very satisfied with their job. And while most people are satisfied with their jobs, I think it's important to keep in mind that fewer than 4 in 10 said that they're very satisfied with their jobs. So at this time when we're talking about the great resignation and the fact that many people are leaving the workforce or they're finding it very easily to go from one job to another, I think it's important to keep in mind that fewer than half, well under half, really more like a third of people in the workforce in California say that they're very satisfied with their job. We also noted in this survey that there is what I would describe as an advancement gap. When we ask people about what kind of opportunities their jobs have for them, that there was, while many people said that there were opportunities for advancement in work, there is a big difference across income groups in terms of how much people felt that their jobs created opportunities both for advancement within the job or to provide opportunities for training and learning that are going to allow them to expand their skill set and become more affluent in the course of their current job and learning skills that will help them find their way to better paying jobs. Better paying jobs, I think, was a big theme throughout this survey. And I just want to, starting out with the recognition that many people said that within their part of California, the lack of well-paying jobs was a problem. About 1 in 5 said it was a big problem. Many people then felt that this was something that was causing them to think about moving elsewhere, particularly moving out of state, and thinking about the long-term opportunities in California for all Californians. The fact that so many people in our survey said that they felt that the gap between the rich and the poor was increasing. This is something that across party lines, people mentioned this, and that children would be worse off than their parents were big themes that up front Dean mentioned in his briefing. The last thing that I want to mention is that going into the 2022 election year, and this is our last survey of 2021, I just want to lay out some basic findings from the survey that will have consequences for the next election year should these findings continue to be where they are. First of all, clearly we hear every day about the fact that the economy is getting better, the job market is good, but the economy itself gets pretty mixed reviews in our survey. There is about as many people who say that they expect good times as they expect bad times, both next year and for the next 5 years in California. And economy and jobs, always something that's on people's minds as they go into an election year. And in our state, voters are not giving the economy rave reviews right now. They're giving it mixed reviews. And I think that going into this election, this is a time of uncertainty in people's minds about where the economy is going. Next year is also a year in which the governor will be up for re-election, and there'll be an election, obviously, also this being a midterm election of members of Congress and members of the legislature in the state. We will be looking during the year at how people are thinking about the economy and the issues that are important to people in California. The governor's approval rating, I thought was very, very interesting. I want to mention was at 62% when we asked about the governor's approval on the economy. That number 62% really made an impression on me because it was 62% of the voters who said that they did not want to recall Governor Newsom in the recall election that happened on September 14th. And the governor's approval rating on not just the economy, but on schools in this survey, right around that range of in the low 60%, which tells us something about the degree to which opinions are settled and set, and very much along partisan lines when it comes to our elected officials. But the future of the economy and the future of our state, very much open questions. We hope that this survey provides a window into that and will spark conversations about how to make California a better place for more Californians to work and to live. Thank you.
Yeah, I thought those were some great takeaways. And I think that, all of that will kind of come together in 2022 to make for an interesting year in which an election is taking place.
So Dean, you mentioned before we got on today that you're working on a blog post from the survey, and maybe you want to give a bit of a preview of what we might anticipate coming from you as after having looked at all the findings and wanting to emphasize something else and make sure that people didn't miss it.
Yeah, so the blog will be looking at kind of the widely held belief among Californians that the gap between the rich and the poor is getting larger in California, and kind of, saying that, this is not anything new. If we go back to a different type of question, we consistently found that people think that California is divided into the haves and the have-nots. And, that people think that looking ahead to 2030, that the gap will actually be larger in 2030 than it is today, which is important. But with a bit of optimism, I think that Californians have generally supported policies that could be useful in addressing this inequality. And so with that in mind, the fact that, most people are supportive of these types of policies, and the fact that there seems to be the wherewithal from the leadership, as well as a budget surplus and federal funds that potentially are going to make some of these things actually doable. And so that to me is kind of a glimmer of optimism as we look to the future of what could happening with what people view as a really significant problem, this widening inequality.
It's really interesting and important. Thank you. So I would like to go ahead and use the rest of the time we have together to answer any questions that might come from anyone who's viewing this today. Part of our transparency, the PPIC survey, to give you a chance to see the results and hear from us, and then ask any questions you might have, whether it's about the findings or the methodology, what it all means and so forth. You can send your questions to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. So I have one question from a viewer in Sacramento. You mentioned that 74% of African Americans say they have education opportunities at work. Can you say anything about variations on this question among African Americans, like by income level or other factors?
Yeah, well, as far as subgroup analysis among African Americans, we can't quite drill deeper among that group. We would have to look into the lower income oversample. Perhaps there's some ability there. But, it was interesting that, African Americans did have this heightened level of kind of belief that they had these growth opportunities, perhaps related that African Americans were among the most likely to say that their job offered, kind of union style or membership into worker organization groups. So perhaps that could be linked there as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. So this is partly a methodological question too. So maybe we should tell our listener from the audience, what was our sample size altogether? And then what was our sample size for African Americans, Dean?
Yeah, so the sample size overall was, given the kind of the oversample of lower income folks, we ended up with, just shy of 2,300 unweighted kind of Californians in this survey. And we ended up with roundabouts just north of 150 African Americans, which is fairly consistent with the kind of representative of 6% of the adult population.
Right. And just to add to that, for the person from Sacramento who asked the question, for PPIC, we tend to not give percentages for numbers when we have fewer than 100 people in the sample, because the margin of error is so large with small samples of that size that it can be misleading to break out the results. So as tempting as it is, our goal in our survey is always to have enough responses so that we can break out the responses by the major racial and ethnic groups, the major demographic groups, the major political groups, and then the subsamples within those groups. Often we just don't have enough to get to 100, which is why at the beginning I talked about the fact that this particular survey is so unique because it allows us to look at lower income residents with a sample of 1,000 with some confidence about what those numbers mean for that 1,000, much more than we would in our normal survey in terms of sample size. And then we can break out the results, like we have results from under 20,000 compared to 20 to 40,000 of lower income residents. And there are some very telling findings in terms of those two groups, as well as some other things that you will see when you go through the crosstabs. Do we have any other questions from our friends in the audience? One new message. Let's see what we have. Why do you think support for job training programs is stronger than for childcare programs, especially since childcare need has received so much attention lately?
It's a great question. And, I think they always say kind of the details matter. And in this case, I think if you look specifically at the kind of, at the wording of the question, it's increased funding so that there are more childcare programs for lower income working parents, right? And so it's a more targeted audience or that would receive this benefit than the job training programs just kind of say increase funding for job training programs so that more people will have the skills needed for today's jobs, right? And so just from a perception angle of looking at those two questions, you could see why perhaps some people would have stronger support for job training programs for all versus kind of childcare programs, which in this case would be for lower income working parents, right? And so that's perhaps one reason, but I don't know. It was a pretty interesting finding given the amount of attention that we have seen on working parents and kind of what's happened during kind of the pandemic with that group.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's a really good finding to describe. Very, very important. Obviously, there were a lot of people who felt that both were very important, and then one a bit more than the other. And Dean provides some clarity as to why. Well, a question about, did anything surprise you about your survey findings? I guess that one's for both of us, Dean, so I'll let you go first.
Sure enough. I think one thing that was surprising is the kind of the similarity in so many questions compared to a year ago, that seemingly we're in a much better place from a economics and job standpoint, from an overall economy standpoint, much better than a year ago. But on question after question, if you look at the time trends, which I encourage you all to do, you can find those online as well among all adults and the lower income group as well. Time and time again, there were just so many similarities year over year. And to me, that was really interesting. I think is probably at least somewhat related to the fact that there's a large chunk of people, I think, that things weren't totally impacted last year with the whole, the impact of the pandemic was uneven, but there was a large swath of folks where the impact wasn't really great. And so perhaps there's just kind of, that's driving this, but that was really surprising to me.
That's such a good point. And one of the reasons we do surveys, because we look at the environment objectively and say, well, all these things have changed. People have got to be feeling better. And then people go and vote like they're not happy. And then, it's like, how did that happen? It's so much better than it was last year. And then you find out from the surveys that, well, maybe you thought people were happier, but they're actually not happier. And then the question is, why not? Just like in our mixed reviews on the economy, it's like, well, there's something going on there that is unsettling to people, that is not really giving them as much comfort about where we are in the economy or security as we thought that they were. And now we know, because we did the survey in November that will give us a point of comparison with what it was like a year ago. And hey, you know what? It's better, but not really as much as we might have thought, So that's interesting.
That kind of goes back to our early discussions about this survey about, the last year was kind of the first year we did this. And so coming back this year, there were discussions about, well, what can we add? What can we change? But given last year was a baseline, we really wanted to come back with a lot of the same questions so that we could gauge and not just assume that, oh, these things are better. These financial difficulties, people probably aren't experiencing them. And so we came back with a survey that now allows us in many ways to say, okay, so these are year over year similarities. And how can we drill down in some of these areas and explore other areas that maybe kind of flush out the story a bit?
Now we know that some of these things are part of the economic fabric of the state, as opposed to, it happened during the pandemic and that's why people were saying these things, when in fact, a lot of people are struggling year to year. For me, the surprising was around the things that I really didn't know anything about. And Dean and I talked about this before we started the program today, but it was Dean's idea to add some questions this year. We didn't add that many questions, but about where are people working now? How many people are working at home, remotely? How many people are going to work outside the home? And then what do they want next year? What do they want to do next year? And how many people changed to work remotely because of the pandemic? So we didn't have anything about those issues from our surveys since the pandemic began. We asked about them. That was the topic I chose to write about in the blog post that came out yesterday, because it was all new to me in terms of, now I have an understanding about just what a state of variety and flexibility we are now in terms of work location. Those people who have choices, now not everybody else does, and then that has broader implications about issues like inequality that we just talked about. But for me, that was the area of, I guess you could call it surprise, but it was discovery, for me, because this was new stuff and things that hopefully more people need to know as we are experiencing the new world of work. So I don't see that any other questions have come in. I'm going to just ask one more time if anybody has any questions. We're We're here to answer them. Let's see, a new one came in. Okay, they're not ready to say goodbye to us yet, Dean. Let's see. You discussed how the lack of well-paying jobs is a concern for many Californians, including across regions and income. Are there other variations from the findings that you think are important?
Yeah, so I mean, looking specifically at kind of the well-paying jobs thing, I do think that the education differences are interesting, and as well as some of the kind of the differences in perceptions across homeowners and renters on this question and others. Really, I think in some ways it's a proxy for kind of income, but even in other ways, like when you look at just the lower income findings, there are some interesting findings there between kind of the homeowners and the renters. And so, and kind of as a offshoot of this question, as you alluded to, the kind of the share of Californians who are considering moving outside of their part of California because of the lack of well-paying jobs, I think is very important. That overall we find that there's about 1 in 4 Californians say they're seriously considering moving outside of their part of California, with most of them saying they would choose to move outside of the state rather than to another part of California. Mm-hmm. And so, that's jobs, but of course it's also housing and it's also a lot of other things. And so I think those are kind of important notations on that question.
So I think that this might be our last question, but there was a question which we repeated from last year about the extent to which people agreed with this statement. It is important for workers to organize so that employers do not take advantage of them. And we found that 81% said that they agreed, 19% said that they disagreed. What do you make of that finding?
Well, I think, in a state like California, where I think people really value kind of an open workplace and value kind of the ability to organize if people choose, I think it's important that we ask that question, and that the findings were very similar last year when we asked this question. So it's not just because of kind of the new place that we are economically. It is interesting that the results of that question very similar to the results of a question that we asked in parallel that asks about that voting gives people a say in what happens, right? And so that people viewed that equally as important, which to me, that was interesting as a political scientist, the fact that people related organizing in the workplace at pretty much the same level of importance as voting giving people a say. And so to me, that's kind of was the takeaway from that.
Yeah, and for me, it's that all institutions today are going through a crisis of trust, and employers are going through a crisis of trust too. And this is a crisis of trust that doesn't have red or blue stripes, because in this survey, we found that Republicans and Democrats alike said, workers need to do things to organize because employers may be taking advantage of them. And we have a question. This will be our last one because we're almost out of time, from Lenny Mendonca. Hi, Lenny, from Half Moon Bay. Lenny's a member of our statewide leadership council, former head of GoBiz for in the office of the governor, and longtime very influential and important advisor on economic issues. How do you square the poll results with recently announced projected massive state budget surpluses from the LAO? Yeah, it was like 31 billion or something was mentioned yesterday.
I mean, I kind of take that news that I received yesterday with kind of some of the policy options that we present to people, and that if there's all this money and there's the ability to do things, that maybe that we'll see progress on addressing income inequality in some ways.
Yeah. So that's looking at what we might do with it in terms of, Lenny, in terms of squaring the poll results with the fact that we have a big budget surplus. I think goes back to the point at the beginning that this is a time when some people have seen their fortunes rising, particularly those in the highest percentile who have seen capital gains from rise from their investments and their housing investments and so forth. And that's a big part of state revenue. We have a very progressive tax system for that reason. And it's also a time when there are people who are struggling. And the people who are struggling obviously not reflected in the massive state budget surplus, but hopefully will be reflected in the response that the state makes having that state budget surplus. But I would expect in a time like this that you'd see the rising fortunes of the wealthiest Californians creating that big state budget surplus, which was a surprise last year and seems to be a continuing trend, going back to our earlier theme of the fact that income inequality is growing in California. Well, we've reached the end of our program. Dean, I'd like to thank you for your presentation today.
Thank you as always, Mark.
I'd also like to thank the funding partner for this survey, the James Irvine Foundation. I want to take a moment to thank everybody on the virtual events team at PPIC. They've had a very busy week. We really appreciate everything that you've done. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, we've had virtual events at 11 o'clock. Thank you very much. And I want to say a special thank you to Kelly Holt, who's our senior events manager, who will be at the end of the month leaving to go to go on to other things. Kelly, I want to thank you. It's been just a tremendous opportunity for me to work with you over the many years at PPIC that you've worked as our events manager and as our senior events manager. Thank you for all that you've done. Okay, so later today, you're going to receive a survey about this event. Please let us know how we did. Thank you and have a good afternoon.